Poverty costs all of us. And in order to formulate a solution, we first have to understand the problem. So let's take a look at some of the myths and facts about poverty so that we can figure out what to do about it. Here's a myth: the poor are all on governmental assistance. Well, the fact is that only about 25% of the income stream to poor people comes from governmental assistance. Here's a myth: poor people just don't want to work. I mean, you and I know that. We see that. Well, the fact is that 60% of the working poor are full-time workers and still struggling in poverty. Well, let them work for minimum wage. I mean, after all, it's $7.25 an hour, $2.90 a week, $1,208 a month. That's $14,500 a year. But there's another standard we need to look at, and that's the self-sufficiency standard. It includes things like housing, childcare, food, transportation. And it's been calculated for every county in the country. So in Bay County, the self-sufficiency standard is not $7.25, which is minimum wage, but is $7.99 for $16,879 a year, which is above that $14,500 mark that you get for minimum wage. So even working minimum wage, you are below the self-sufficiency standard. The poverty guideline is way down at $10,830 a year. A very, very difficult number to live on. How about for an adult and a child? Well, it jumps up to $14.03 an hour or $29,631 a year. Remember, minimum wage is $14,500. So if you have a mother with a child working full-time at minimum wage, they're only about half of what the self-sufficiency standard is. The poverty guideline for this group is $14,570, which is minimum wage is $14,500. So if a mother is working, she's below the poverty line if she has a child. Full-time. Here's a myth: if you don't have money, you just don't spend it. Well, the fact is that it costs more to shop at the corner grocery because you don't have the transportation to go to the superstore. It costs to cash every check. Even with fees rising in our banks in these days, it still costs far more if you're part of the unbanked. 14 million people in this country don't have any relationship with a bank. They have to pay every time $3, $5, $10. Every time they have to cash a check. The poorest of the poor have to pay the most. Public transportation is time-consuming and inconvenient if it's available at all. Now, here's a chicken and an egg problem, because how do you get the funding for a public transportation system if no one's using it, and how do you expect people to use it unless it's a sufficient system? I don't know. Here's a myth: poverty is a minority thing, when in fact 48% of all those living in poverty are white. Another myth: the United States has one of the lowest poverty rates in the industrialized world. According to the Organization for Economic Developed Countries, the OEDC, we are 27th highest poverty rate in the industrialized world. We're right next to Turkey and Mexico. We think of Mexico as being a place with incredible poverty, and yet we're literally and figuratively their neighbors. The U.S. spends more money on helping the poor than any other industrialized nations. Well, when taken as a percentage of GDP, we are fourth from the bottom. 26 industrialized countries spend more as a percentage on their poverty than we do. Again, we're next to Turkey and Mexico. Here's a myth: it's not my problem. Here's the fact: poverty costs all of us. It costs us in poor education. It costs us in economic development. It costs us in qualified workers. It costs us in higher fees and taxes for our tax base. $115 million is the number from Bay Medical Center, which is their uncollected debt from charity care and lower insurance reimbursement rates. Who do you think pays and makes up for that $115 million but you and I that have medical insurance that pays higher rates? We're paying for somebody else's poverty across the board. Here's a myth: it's easier to spend money on incarceration than it is on education. Well, perhaps in the short run, but poverty is linked to crime. The higher a poverty rate in a community, the higher the crime rate. It costs $21,000 a year to incarcerate one inmate at the county level, and it costs $9,000 to educate one student. Currently, our present school funding is not fully addressing our educational needs. It leads to unskilled workers, increased poverty, reduced tax base, further declining education, and giving us a higher level of poverty. There's a tipping point somewhere here, and I hope we're not close to it, because after that, you can't recover. 15% is the rate of unemployment for high school dropouts. These numbers were taken a couple of years ago, but the fact is that wherever it is, the rate for high school dropouts is much higher than college graduates. Less than 5% is the rate for college graduates, unemployment rate for college graduates. Here's a myth: you can't get rid of poverty. It's everywhere. Let's take a look at a poverty map of the United States. You'll see that there are hot spots along the Mississippi Delta, somewhere up in the Kentucky, West Virginia area, down in the south part of Texas. But let's take a look at our counties. Bay County has a poverty rate of 14.4%. Gulf County has a poverty rate of 23%. And Franklin County has a poverty rate of 23.1%. Now, if you calculate between the ages of 5 and 17, what percentage of those people, those kids and teenagers, are in poverty? In Bay County, it's 22%. In Gulf County, it's 25.4%. And in Franklin County, it's over 30%. 1 in every 3 in this age group is living in poverty. One of the ratings that we have is the subsidized lunch program. In Bay County, 49.58% of the kids that are in our school systems have subsidized lunches, meaning that they're below the poverty line. 1 out of every 2. Here's a myth: all we need is some economic development. But blighted neighborhoods do not attract new business. Reduced tax bases do not give us the possibility of coming up and attracting business. We can't offer them what they need. Current tax base leads to poor educational funding, leads to unqualified workers, leads to poor worker retention, higher business costs, less economic development, not more, and further reduced tax base. So it continues to spiral downward. Economic development demands a qualified workforce. Now, here's an interesting thing: turnover costs. People sometimes don't calculate these accurately, but every time you fire a worker and hire a new one, every time one worker turns over, there are costs engaged in that, including the exit costs, recruiting, interviewing, and this whole list that you'll see up on the board right now. The estimated cost of turnover for an $8 an hour employee by the Society of Human Resource Management is $3,500 for every turnover. $36.37 by Coca-Cola Retailing. The American Management Association says it's $4,000, and the American Hotel and Motel Association says it's $4,100 every time an $8 an hour employee has to be turned over. So the cost of turnover for medium-sized business, and let's take the lower of those numbers, 3,500, 100 employees, 50% turnover, that's going to cost that business an extra $175,000 a year if we can't provide qualified workers that don't need to be turned over. In a slightly larger business, $3,500 again per turnover, but 500 employees this time with a 60% turnover rate, and it's going to cost over $1 million a year. Businesses are not going to locate in a place where there aren't qualified workers. We need training to develop ready task force. But one of the things beneath that is that we need a motivation and commitment to explain and empower people that are in poverty what it takes to step out of poverty. Part of the Bridges to Circle program is a course called Getting Ahead in a Just Getting By World. It's a 15-week course. The participants apply through a screening process, and attendance is required. It's an interactive group that leads people to understand what it's going to take to empower themselves out of poverty. It's run in conjunction with the Bridges to Circles program, Panama City, Florida, which is what we're talking about and what we want to start in this area. It's part of the Circles national campaign. It's based on the Circles model, where you get middle-class people together with people that are at the poverty level, and they share and network and support each other. It takes the entire community, governmental sector, business sector, education sector, and social service agencies working together to effectively address poverty. Fred Keller, founder and CEO of Cascade Engineering. So what do? Learn about what's happening in our community. Learn what you can do to combat poverty in our community. This has been brought to you by Bridges to Circles in conjunction with Catholic Charities United Way and the Circles National Campaign. For more information, contact this link. Thank you very much.